Imagine a field, baking under a Mesopotamian sun. Beside it flows a canal, a ribbon of life, its water diverted from the great Euphrates River. Barges glide past, heaped with grain for the city of Ur. But look closer at the field itself. Between the stalks of barley, the soil glitters with a fine white crust. This is salt, and it is a death warrant, delivered by the very water meant to bring life. The world's first cities were built on a revolutionary idea that humanity could command rivers, conquer drought, and create abundance from dust. But they overlooked a quiet, relentless chemistry, a flaw in their magnificent design. The water they brought to their fields could not easily leave. This is the story of Sumer, a civilization built by irrigation, and a collapse driven by the slow, creeping poison of salt. Our story begins on the southern alluvium, the flat, fertile plain laid down by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This land is a paradox. It is made of rich river mud, yet it barely rains. A whole year might see less than 200 millimeters of water fall from the sky. Without the rivers, it would be a desert, but with them, harnessed by human ingenuity, it became the cradle of urban life. Around 3500 BCE, during what we call the Uruk period, this land saw an explosion. The city of Uruk itself swelled to cover hundreds of hectares, home to tens of thousands of people. Its inhabitants lived not in scattered villages, but in a dense, organized, mud-brick metropolis, dominated by the temple tower, the ziggurat, that reached for the heavens. This was something new in the world, a concentration of people and power made possible by one thing: a stable, year-round supply of food. The engine that powered Uruk and its sister cities, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, was the canal. These weren't simple ditches, they were engineered systems. Gates controlled the flow, reservoirs stored the spring floods, and a web of smaller channels delivered water to individual plots with remarkable precision. To manage this system, the Sumerians invented bureaucracy. The great temple and palace households were not just places of worship or royalty. They were vast economic institutions. They organized the armies of laborers needed to dig and, crucially, to dredge the canals year after year. To track the grain that flowed from the fields to the central granaries, they invented writing. On tens of thousands of clay tablets, scribes recorded the inputs and outputs of this grain-based economy. They used precise units of measurement: the iku for a small plot of land, the bur for a larger one, and the sila, about a liter, to measure the daily ration of barley for a worker. This was a society run on logistics, where the stroke of a stylus on wet clay ensured a laborer got his bread and beer. The canals were more than just irrigation channels. They were the arteries of the state. The grandest of these, like the Iturungal Canal built during the 3rd dynasty of Ur, were massive public works that functioned like highways, linking the core cities of the empire. Royal inscriptions, and even the names of years, celebrated their construction. A king like Shulgi, who ruled in the 21st century BCE, might name a year of his reign: the year the king dug the canal that brings abundance. For a Sumerian king, digging a canal was as vital a statement of power as winning a battle. It was a promise of stability and prosperity to his people and the gods. Statues of rulers like Gudea of Lagash show him seated with a temple plan on his lap, a plan that included the layout of the sacred canals that would make the temple's lands fertile. To rule was to command the water. A silted canal meant empty granaries and a weakened state. A flowing canal was a sign of divine favor and competent kingship. But within the meticulous records of the scribes, a secret story was unfolding. a clue to the coming crisis. If you read the tablets from the earlier 3rd millennium BCE, you find wheat, particularly a type called emmer, is a common staple. It appears frequently in harvest tallies and ration lists. But as centuries pass, a subtle change occurs. By the time of the 3rd dynasty of around 2100 BCE, the records from major agricultural provinces like Umma and Lagash tell a different story. Wheat becomes scarce. The pages, or rather the tablets, are dominated by a different grain, barley. Barley bread and barley beer become the universal currency of payment for labor. This was not a simple change in taste or fashion. This was an adaptation. The farmers and scribes of Sumer were reacting to a fundamental change in the land beneath their feet. The soil itself was sending them a message, and they were answering by planting the one crop that could endure it. To understand the switch to barley, we have to understand the unseen enemy: salt. The geology of southern Mesopotamia was both a blessing and a curse. The plain is extraordinarily flat, dropping only a few centimeters for every kilometer. This is perfect for irrigation, allowing water to spread easily, but it's terrible for drainage. Water moves slowly, and it tends to sit. Beneath this plain lies a shallow water table, and this groundwater is naturally saline. Now, add the relentless sun. The region's evaporation rate is immense, capable of pulling over 2 meters of water from the surface each year. This intense evaporation acts like a wick. Through a process called capillary action, the saline groundwater is drawn up through the tiny pores in the soil toward the surface. As the water evaporates, the salt is left behind in the root zone of the crops. Year after year, irrigation cycle after irrigation cycle, the concentration of salt builds. The Sumerians had created a perfect slow-motion machine for salting their own earth. This is why barley became king. All plants have a threshold for salt, but barley's is significantly higher than wheat's. As salt levels in a field crept up, wheat yields would be the first to suffer. The plants would be stunted, their heads producing less grain. A farmer would see his wheat crop fail, while the hardier barley in the next plot still produced a viable harvest. So, he adapted. The next year, he planted more barley. The state, seeing the declining wheat returns, demanded its taxes in the crop that was most reliable. The shift we see in the tablets wasn't a choice so much as a necessity. It was a brilliant short-term solution to a long-term problem. For a time, it worked. The granaries remained full, the cities were fed, and the system held. But it was a sign of a system under immense ecological stress. The Sumerians were running out of good land. They were retreating to their last line of defense, a single, salt-tolerant crop. The stress began to show in other ways. Water, once a source of collective wealth, became a source of violent conflict. On a limestone monument called the Stele of the Vultures, we see the story of a brutal war fought around 2450 BCE between the cities of Lagash and Umma. The prize was a fertile border territory called the Guadena, a name that means the edge of the plain. This was not a war for a city, but for a block of irrigated land. The carvings depict soldiers clashing over boundary canals and dikes. Control the water, you control the food. Centuries later, the anxiety over water management is written directly into the law. The famous Code of Hammurabi from Babylon around 1750 BCE contains clauses that read like a farmer's nightmare. If a man neglects his dike and it breaks and floods his neighbor's field, he must repay the lost grain. If he cannot, his possessions and even he himself are to be sold to cover the debt. These laws were not theoretical. They were carved from the hard experience of countless seasons where a moment of neglect led to disaster. The system was fragile, dependent on constant maintenance and a stable central authority. When that authority fractured, the consequences were devastating. Around 2004 BCE, the powerful Third Dynasty of Ur collapsed under pressure from Elamite invaders from the east and migrating Amorite groups from the west. With the state gone, there was no one to organize the massive, coordinated labor needed for dredging the great canals. Channels began to silt up, cutting off water to entire districts. A single neglected dike could breach and flood fields for miles, waterlogging the soil and accelerating the rise of salt. This political collapse was amplified by climate stress. A period of increased aridity, often called the 4.2 kiloyear event, was affecting the entire Near East, likely reducing the flow of the Tigris and Euphrates. Less water in the rivers meant less water available to flush the salts from the fields. Political chaos, ecological degradation, and climate change became a vicious feedback loop. Each problem made the others worse. What did this unraveling feel like for the people on the ground? For a laborer, it meant the ration from the central storehouse grew smaller. The scribe's tablet records a bit less barley this month than the last. That is hunger, recorded in clean, precise script. For a farmer, it was the sight of a white field, a plot so crusted with salt that nothing would grow. He might be ordered to try and leach it, flooding it with precious water in a desperate attempt to wash the salts deeper into the soil. But without proper drainage, it was often a futile gesture. For a merchant, it meant the river that once brought ships to his city's quay had shifted its course. Over years of siltation, the riverbed built up until, in a great flood, the water cut a new, lower path a kilometer away. The port was now a mudflat. The boats stopped coming. The market withered. For a family, it may have meant the hardest decision of all: to abandon the ancestral land of their gods and ancestors and move north, hoping for better soil and a more reliable river. And so, over centuries, the center of Mesopotamian power drifted north. After the fall of Ur, new centers of power arose at Isin and Larsa, slightly to the north. But the great shift was toward Babylon. This wasn't just a matter of military conquest, it was a move dictated by hydrology. The northern part of the alluvial plain had a slightly steeper gradient, which meant better natural drainage. The soils were less exhausted, less saline. The Euphrates River in this region was more stable and easier to control. The ecological foundations for a large, sustainable state were simply stronger there. Conquest and dynasties followed this subtle geographical logic. Power flowed away from the salinized, waterlogged heartland of Sumerian civilization toward lands with healthier soil and more forgiving rivers. The great southern cities that had pioneered urban life, Uruk, Ur, Eridu, slowly dwindled, their populations shrinking as their agricultural base eroded from beneath them. What remains of this grand experiment? The ziggurat of Ur still stands, a mountain of baked brick rising from the flat plain, its lower courses sealed with the black bitumen that waterproofed their canals. In museums, the stele of the Vultures and the code of Hammurabi testify to a society obsessed with land and water. And in climate-controlled drawers lie the tens of thousands of clay tablets, the administrative records that, when deciphered, quietly told the story of the pivot from wheat to barley. Even the landscape holds the memory. From satellites, archaeologists can trace the faint lines of ghost canals and ancient field systems. And if you walk those southern plains today, after the fierce heat of summer, you can still see it, the glitter of white salt on the surface of the brown earth, the same chemistry that challenged the world's first kings is still at work. The collapse was not total, nor was it instant. But the Sumerians discovered a fundamental law of hydraulic engineering, one that echoes down to our own time. The rule they learned is this: in a land of little rain and slow-moving rivers, bringing water to the land is only half the solution. Abundance is only sustainable if the water can also be taken away. Without effective drainage, irrigation is a poisoned gift, and the wealth it creates is temporary. The salt will always build. The soil will always die. The Sumerians were brilliant pioneers, but they were ultimately trapped by the very success of their own invention. Their story is a foundational lesson, written in salt and clay. If you find this journey into the rise and fall of ancient worlds compelling, subscribe and continue exploring with us here at Dustkings. There are more empires in the dust and more lessons waiting to be unearthed.